So this is another episode in My Life, My Practice with Margo McLoughlin. And this is a particularly interesting type of practice. Margo is a storyteller, Buddhist storyteller, specializing in Jatakas and some of the commentarial stories as well, Buddhist legends. And Margo came to my attention some years ago. She told a story, I think it was in Victoria, at the Victoria meditation group. Maybe I was teaching it or something and I heard you. Anyway, it's quite remarkable. I was astonished that first of all, I haven't not experienced a Jataka storyteller in Asia. I heard them recorded and so forth, but not live. And then I heard you tell these Jataka stories, and they were just so remarkably well done. And I thought, how does this anomaly, where does this person come from? How does this happen? On the west coast of Vancouver Island, actually. How does this Canadian woman tell Jataka stories with such grace and skill? How does this happen? So I brought Margo here to tell some stories and so that we could video them. You told, I think, 4 stories while you were here. What are the titles of those stories?
The first one is Kaka Jataka, the crow birth, which is Jataka, I think it's number 140 in the collected 7 volumes of the Jataka tales. The second one is Kurunga Miga Jataka, the antelope birth. So each title refers probably to the particular form that the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, incarnated into in that birth. And the third one is Chitta Sambhuta Jataka, which is the name of the 2 main characters in the story. It's the story of the Buddha and his cousin Ananda, who take birth as outcasts. And that's Jataka number 498. And then the fourth story is one of the Buddhist legends. It's called The Legend of the Weaver's Daughter. And it, as you mentioned, it's a commentarial story referring to a particular verse in the Dhammapada.
Yeah, these form the basis of these stories, and each story is very, very moving, very instructive as well. I'll leave it, the audience can watch the videos themselves and listen to the stories for their impact. Let's just talk a little bit about your life. How does a woman on the west coast of Canada end up reciting Buddhist folk tales? How does this happen?
Well, I think I have always had an intuition about what draws me.
Yes.
And after being drawn to Buddhist practice, I had the experience of sitting a retreat with a teacher who told the Jataka tales. And that was Steve Smith. And he told them in a beautiful, animated style. And shortly after that, maybe a couple of years later, I was asked to tell stories at a summer festival in Comox on Vancouver Island. And I thought, well, if I'm going to tell stories, and I was asked to tell them in French, actually, I want to translate some of the Jataka tales into French so that I can tell them in French. And so a friend sent me a collection of retellings by an American storyteller, Rafe Martin. And so I translated them into French, and I began telling them at this festival. And it was really quite a remarkable experience of telling and feeling the congruity, the absolute rightness of what I was doing. And it seemed as I was telling, and actually I was telling a bilingual version, a little bit of French, some English, back and forth. It seemed like I couldn't miss a word. There was such a degree of concentration and focus. And it was really the beginning of my experience as a storyteller and my particular interest in telling these stories.
So you are bilingual, you're fluent in French and English. Any other languages?
I speak some German, but not fluently.
And these translations are done from the Pali by you. So you somewhere, you've gone off and learned yourself some Pali. How did that happen?
Well, I was serving as a cook at the retreat center at Insight Meditation Society in Barrie. Mm-hmm. And staff had the opportunity to attend any courses they wanted at the Barrie Center for Buddhist Studies. And there was a weekend given by Andrew Walensky on Pali, Introduction to the Pali Language. So I attended, and I was just in awe that there could be a language that was entirely Buddhist in its nature. I mean, it was every word in the Pali English dictionary can be traced to some part of the Pali canon or the commentarial literature. So I got very interested in Pali, and at the end of my time as a cook, I was a scholar in residence for a few weeks and began translating my first Jataka tale.
So you just picked what year was that?
That would have been 1998.
Mm-hmm. So that's 20 years ago. So you've been absorbing Pali, translating them into different stories ever since. It's all very unusual also for Buddhist practitioners in the West to pick up Pali as well. So you're an unusual person. You're a storyteller, and you were telling me that you also were interested in writing. So the two forms, the written form and the oral delivery, are part of your interests. And so you're just basically a storyteller, a story factory, a story machine, aren't you? You were telling me about this, your first influence, this French teacher in it was a French immersion school or a bilingual immersion school?
Actually, it was a precursor of the French immersion schools. It was York House, a private girls' school that was introducing a bilingual, bicultural program. Mm-hmm. And they hired teachers from Quebec and from France. And our teacher, Maggie Duchenne, was from a small village north of Paris. And she was an adventurer. She'd come out to Canada and found this job. And she had a very unorthodox style of teaching. She really believed in adventure. Well, imagination as a form of adventure, but also taking us out, taking us into the city. And we accompanied her on the bus to the downtown east side. We served at a mission for homeless men. We visited junk stores. We went to wild urban parks, and we had adventures. And I think that was really a formative influence in my life.
And she told stories.
And she had really the gift of telling improvised stories. It was almost as if she could see in the faces of her listening audience what the story needed next. And all kinds of fantastical things would happen. But she also based her stories on her own experience of growing up in France during the Second World War. So stories of really camaraderie and justice and overcoming oppression.
Yeah, very, very interesting. That really grabbed your imagination and the moral dimension of these things. And so when did you start telling stories? Did you start telling stories before you were introduced to the Jataka stories, or was that the impetus for beginning to actually tell stories?
Well, I had nephews and a niece, so I definitely told them stories. And I think I might have been telling stories before then. It's interesting to kind of trace it. I'm not sure. I think I was telling stories, but in informal ways.
Right. So let's say from for the last 20 years, where do you tell these stories, these Buddhist stories?
Well, after I was working as a cook, serving as a cook at the retreat center, I went to the Divinity School at Harvard.
Now this is interesting. Let's not skip over this. So you went from being serving. Now this is a part of Buddhist culture as well. Stewards volunteer to do the various necessary support structures for meditation retreats. It happens in monasteries all the time. At Birken here, we have 6 stewards, including the video steward who is videoing this. And so these people are from all walks of life, and they volunteer to assist in the background. And so you were volunteering to assist in the kitchen there. And you went from there to the Harvard Divinity School, which is, I guess, Barre, Massachusetts. It's not that far from Boston, where Harvard is. So you went to the Harvard Divinity School to do what?
Well, initially it was with a very clear focus on studying the Buddhist texts and learning Sanskrit and Pali in a formal setting. And then I found the pace of study and the cerebral aspect of graduate school not completely my cup of tea. And I thought, all right, I want to do a chaplaincy. I want to do a degree in divinity, which was required that one take a practicum and do work in a hospital setting or in another setting. And I thought about stories as ministry. So really storytelling as a form of ministry. And so I switched to the divinity program and had an opportunity to be an interfaith chaplain at Dana-Farber at the Cancer Institute in Boston, where I actually led some storytelling series for patients and staff. And but meanwhile, I was also studying Sanskrit and Pali and translating more stories. And at Harvard, I had the opportunity to tell them in different settings. But also, I was invited to return to the retreat center in Barre and perform during Integration Week. So this is the last week before people come out of silence after 6 weeks or 3 months of practice. So it's a very unusual audience because they are so receptive.
Yes.
They haven't watched TV or seen a movie or even listened to music or read a book or a magazine. Their primary entertainment is reading the notice board.
Yes.
So I would, for several years, go out during Integration Week and tell the Jataka tales there. And it was just remarkable.
And you came back to Vancouver, Victoria, and have continued telling the stories in various retreats and various venues. And that's where I heard. Now, do you remember how I heard you the first time? Where did I hear you?
Well, it was right here at
Right
Berkeley.
here.
It was New Year's Eve, and there was a bonfire outside, and another retreatant from Seattle had heard me telling in Seattle. She mentioned to you that I was a storyteller, and you invited me to tell some stories as part of the New Year's Eve festivities here at Birken.
Right. Yes, I remember that. And then, so it's been on my mind ever since to get Margo here and video her now that we have this collection of videos and also a collection of my life, my practice, to introduce people to the spectrum of lay practitioners and monastic practitioners in the West, how large the diversity here. And so this is something that is, we've done mindfulness to death. We've done all of these retreats, loving kindness retreats. There's other dimensions which are familiar in Asia. So yesterday, we had a group of 24 Sri Lankans here, including kids, and I asked Margo to tell a Jataka story. And most of those, especially the adults, have heard Jataka stories as they were growing up in Asia. So it's a part of the culture there. It's like Bible stories or something from here. All of English literature is really influenced by the stories from the Bible. And in Asia, these Jataka stories are just pervasive. They're floating around and influencing everything. So I wanted to introduce a larger audience to this aspect of life. And for some, it may be riveting and a great way to learn as well, because these stories are very, very moving. And you will see Margo telling some stories and feel the impact of the lessons behind them. So, yeah, I had wanted to, before we did the video thing, I wanted to take you on tour, and it's kind of like a show. It really is a show. And in Asia, the performers, they will perform these Jataka tales on stage, and sometimes even the monks will be part of it, playing various roles in the Jataka tales. So it's really something to find this in Western culture, and I'm really trying to promote this as another large aspect of the approach to Dhamma. So they just tell us about the four tales that you're going that will be on these videos.
Well, the first one is the crow story, the crow birth, and I wrote a commentary about this for the Barry Center's journal. But this story fascinates me because it represents the intersection of different karma, of different people's lives, and how our actions, we don't know actually what result they will have. So there's so many wonderful things to unpack in that story. So, and also, I think it's so interesting that the Buddha, who in his, the story of the Buddha's life, he is prince of the Sakyan clan. So he comes from a position of privilege. And in this story, he is born as the king of the crows. So this is a bird that scavenges on carrion. And he lives in a forest cemetery. So there are all these ways in which the story is subverting our ideas of who should be a teacher and who can offer us wisdom. Right. Yeah.
This particular use of animals in these stories is interesting. This is something that took a while in the West to get. There's a very distinct separation between humans and animals in the West, and that has to do with Christianity. In Buddhism, the idea that you can take rebirth as an animal and an animal can take rebirth as a human, and there's a kind of an evolutionary interflow between them, and that the characteristics that animals display, characteristics which are also found in humans. This is really not discovered up until Darwin, He's trying to make the point that, that you are evolved out of the animals. and that they share some of these, you share with them some of these capacities. You see this in the Jataka stories. They're using animals as, now it's certainly a story. It's the crows are talking very intelligently to each other, expressing sophisticated ideas and so forth, but it also has an influence on just non-harm towards animals, like appreciation that these are intelligent beings and they have their ways, and we need to appreciate that. That's only come, so in the West Coast, this discovery of the intelligence of the killer whale or the orca is a very recent thing. It's only 40 years old. Before that, they were just hunted as just kind of dangerous animals. Now we realize they have whole family structures and that they live a long time. They're intelligent, responsive. So we're emerging out of a dark age into this. And these Jataka tales are very, very interesting for this. The appreciation of the higher sensitivities of these animals as well. And the next, the story about the deer, and tell a little bit about that one.
Actually, it's an antelope. So this is a story of friendship, and I've told this story, leaving out sometimes the Buddhist context. I've told this story many, many places, in schools. I've told it in Mississippi. And it really continues to move me as a story because there are so many aspects of friendship that are revealed. And one particular aspect is the way a friend sees you and knows who you are and invites your skills and your talents into the light. And so the antelope is trapped, and his two friends, the woodpecker and the turtle, do their best to rescue him. But the woodpecker says to the turtle, "You have a beak. Use your beak. And then I will use my wings. I will try to stop the hunter if I can." So the three friends work together. And in recent years, I've really emphasized the diversity aspect, that they don't walk the same, they don't talk the same, they don't look the same, but they were friends. And they respected and admired each other, and they were loyal. And often when I tell the story to children, I'll say, "Well, what makes a good friend?" And they'll say, "Oh, a friend is someone you can trust. Friend helps you if you fall down."
Right.
Yeah, so...
That is protective of your life, your very life. And that is the Buddhist definition of friendship. And you have a story which is from the Buddhist legends about it's a very, very good story, a 16-year-old girl. So tell us, just summarize that story a little bit.
Well, this story I think of as inspiring us to consider how our practice can be guided by a resolve, a clear resolve. So this young woman, she's returning from her father's workshop. She's the daughter of a weaver. So she has duties to fulfill to help her father in his profession. And some friends invite her to come and hear the Buddha. And the Buddha has arrived near the town where she lives, and he will be there in residence for a few months. And her friends invite her to come and hear the Buddha give a teaching. And so she agrees. And it happens that that day he's giving a teaching on mindfulness of death. So she listens with great attentiveness, and she really takes in his instructions. Life is uncertain. Death is certain. Practice and develop this mindfulness of death. And of all the people who are sitting there, all different professions, lay people, householders, she makes the resolve that she will take this teaching to heart and she will apply it in her own life. And so as I tell the story, I explore the rhythm of her practice and the ways that she found to remember and call to mind, life is uncertain, death is certain. So in a sense, that's That's the story. It's really about her daily life and her practice and the transformation of her heart and mind, and how becoming aware on a very day-to-day basis of the truth of that uncertainty brings up a great deal of compassion in her for everyone she meets.
It's a great story for teenagers as well, because she's 16. The story goes on for about 3 years of her life. She actually dies at 19, I think, if I calculated right. But it's never too early to have profound spiritual understandings.
Mm-hmm.
And you told me a little story about you being 17 and going on a camp, a sort of a outward bound thing for a month, and part of it was 3 days alone in the wilderness. Very profound. And when you're 17 or 16 or whatever, these events are incredibly transformative, can carry through your life. And quite often people who hear these things or experience these things as teenagers take them much more seriously and integrate this truth much better than people later on as adults. And in that story, you see the adults kind of wandering off and forgetting this very profound lesson about the uncertainty of life and the certainty of death. And the young woman, what's her name?
She actually, which is quite interesting, she has never given a name.
She has no name. So that's why I couldn't remember her name.
So when her friends call out to her, they're actually calling out Weaver's daughter. Pesakaradite.
Weaver's daughter.
Yeah. So and it's so interesting that she is anonymous.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. Have you told that to teenagers?
I did. I told it at the young adult retreat at Insight Meditation Society.
Yeah.
And one young man afterwards, he said to me, "That was amazing. Your presentation was virtually flawless."
They're a little bit preoccupied with getting a good mark at school as well, aren't they, teenagers? Yeah, that's a very moving story.
And I know that it precipitated some good conversation
Yeah.
in the groups at that retreat. Yeah.
I'm going to recommend it I have social workers who work with teens, and they're always asking me for resources for teaching. And I have a few stories from that, but I'm going to recommend that story for them as well. And the fourth story is what?
So the fourth story is Chitta Sambhuta, Jataka, and this is the story I translated for my master's thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Translated it, commented on it, and performed it in the chapel at the Harvard Divinity School with musical accompaniment. A friend was playing a South Indian drum, the mridanga. So this story is, again, very subversive. The Buddha-to-be, the Bodhisattva, and his cousin are born as outcasts. So the lowest of the low in the caste system. And they are acrobats. And they dare to perform at the city gates. And because two young noblewomen see them, a whole series of events unfold, which leads them to abandon their home, disguise themselves as Brahmin youth, and eventually they die and are reborn. And in the course of the story, they are reborn 4 times. So it's an interesting story because it's one of the few Jataka tales that actually show different lives within a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also very touching as a compassionate story about the Chandalas, the lowest caste in India. And it's a good one for people who are in a disadvantaged condition, and it happens all over the world that certain people end up on the bottom of the pile. And the Bodhisattva is born as an outcast. The Buddha-to-be and his great attendant Ananda are born as outcasts, and they have to deal with that harsh and discriminatory language and so forth. So it's a beautiful story also for for identification with this. It's written along. The story is maybe 2,500 years old, so it's remarkable because in India at the time there was not, and right up till the present, there was virtually no sympathy for the underdog, the lowest caste. But I think a lot of people can draw two lessons from it. One is about friendship, and why do we find ourselves with certain people? Is this the first life for this friendship? And secondly, this what it's like to be beneath the underdog and trying to work your way up. So those are the 4 tales that Margo will tell in the other videos, and I hope that the audience finds them as fascinating as I do, and part of the fascination is Margo herself, how this happens. There's a Jataka story in Margo. I think I'm going to have to create some stories about previous lives of Margo. Although I'm a bit of a strange one as well. What am I? I'm a Buddhist monk in Canada in a forest monastery, so we're a couple of strange creatures that have arisen. Maybe we have long Jataka's story behind us as well. So I encourage you all to watch these videos and appreciate these incredible stories.